Welcome to part 10 of my Blender for Complete Beginners tutorial series. If you haven't seen the previous parts, then definitely check out the tutorial playlist with the link in the description. So in this part, we're going to be going over the different render engines in Blender, and then we're also going to be going over lighting. So I'll show you how to add the different lights and what the different lights do, and how to set up some basic lighting to our snowman scene. And if you're enjoying this tutorial series and you'd like to help support me, then some great ways to do that are by checking out my Gumroad store and Patreon page, where you can get lots of Blender content, and you can also purchase the project files with the snowman artwork. And then before we start, I also wanted to let you know about a really great Blender add-on for getting realistic sky lighting. The Pro Atmo Addon is an amazing Blender add-on for getting realistic sky lighting, as well as sky and space backgrounds. The add-on is very customizable, including settings for the ground, atmosphere, sun, clouds, planets, stars, and even nebula. The add-on also comes with some presets that you can choose from, like cloud presets and nebula presets. You can also add planets to your skies, and you can even create your own deep space backgrounds. You can find my full add-on review video with the link in the description, and if you purchase the add-on through my affiliate link, you'll be helping to support this channel. So before we go over lighting in Blender, we need to go over render engines, because when we're previewing the lighting, we're going to need to preview the lighting in the rendered view to actually see what the lighting looks like. So let's click right over here on the render properties. Now in Blender, there are three main rendering engines. There are actually two main rendering engines, but then there's also this workspace, and we'll go over all three of these. So the first one here on default is Blender Eevee. So the Eevee rendering engine is a real-time rendering engine. If I hold down the Z button and then move my mouse up into the rendered view, you can see Blender is rendering in real time. Now it's really gray right now, but what I'll do is just press Shift A for the add menu. I'm going to go down here to light, and I'm going to add a sunlight, and I'll talk about all the lights later in this part, but let's just add a sunlight. I can hit G to grab and R to rotate. Let's rotate the sunlight. And then also if we click here to go to the object data properties of the light settings, let's just turn the strength up. Alright, so I'll go back to the rendering engines. So you can see Eevee is a real-time rendering engine, so it's going to render everything in real time. And when you are in the material preview, it doesn't matter what render engine you're using, in the material preview, it's going to use the settings of Eevee. But it's also going to use these little light spheres right here, so these HDRIs, which are built into Blender. Now the benefit of Eevee is that it generally renders much faster than Cycles, but the downside to Eevee is that it usually isn't quite as realistic. So because it is a real-time render engine, it's similar to how a game would render in real time. It's not quite as realistic because it's not able to actually simulate all the light. Now after you choose the render engine, there's going to be lots of different settings here to control the render engine. For example, there is a bloom here, and if you turn on bloom, you can see that the light areas are going to have kind of a glare effect. And depending on which render engine you're using, there's going to be different settings. So let's go to the next one. So I'll click here on Eevee, and we're going to change it to Cycles. And you can see now it is rendering much slower. But what you might also notice is that Cycles looks much more realistic. So Cycles is the main rendering engine that I use. I pretty much use Cycles for everything. Occasionally I use Eevee, but really I do prefer to render things realistically, and I'll be using it for the rest of the tutorial. And it's much more realistic because it is what is called a ray traced render engine. And so it's very realistic, and it actually simulates the light. So the benefit of Cycles is that it renders much more realistically, however it does take longer to render than Blender Eevee. Now if you have an older or slower computer and it's taking a very long time to render, then you could totally just use Blender Eevee, and you could just create artworks which use Blender Eevee. That's totally fine. So it really is up to you whether you want to use Cycles or Eevee. Now you might also notice with Cycles, if I kind of zoom in here, you can see that there are some grainy areas, and you can especially see it in the shadows, but the graininess is everywhere. And that is because it's a ray traced render engine, so it's actually simulating the light, so it's having the sunlight shine down, and it's actually simulating how the light would bounce off of the objects. And so you can kind of see there's like this orange part there, and that's kind of like the reflections of the carrot. And like right over here, you can actually see that there's kind of like a little bit of red lighting, and so that's actually bouncing off the light of the scarf. You can see if I select the scarf and press H to hide it, now that red lighting goes away. But if I press Alt H to bring it back, you can see it comes back. Now you can see that some of the settings have changed. So I showed you in Blender Eevee how to turn on that bloom feature, but you can see in Cycles it doesn't actually have the bloom. However, there are lots of other settings in Cycles. So depending on which render engine you're using, the settings might be a little bit different. Now there's also this workbench here, and this workbench engine, we're really not going to be using this, but this is basically just going to give you a matcap view. So if you just want to render this using that matte cap in Blender, then you can use Workbench and it will render whatever matte cap you've chosen right here. But I'm not going to use this in the tutorial. I don't really use the Workbench that much. So let's click here on Workbench and I'm going to change it over to Cycles. So let's go over the main settings that you need to know for the Cycles rendering engine. Now, before we do that, I do want to use my GPU. So my GPU is the graphics card in my computer and it renders much faster than my CPU. So all computers do have a CPU, but then some computers have a GPU and a CPU. So I actually built my own computer, and so I put a CPU and a GPU in it. And usually like gaming computers or gaming laptops, they will come with a GPU because GPU is helpful when it's rendering the game. So if you do have a GPU in your computer, then you can use it instead. And generally speaking, a GPU is going to be faster than a CPU. And so you can change it to GPU and your computer should be able to render the scene much faster. Now, if you haven't ever used your GPU in Blender before, then you actually need to set it up in Blender's user preferences. And that's actually really easy to do. So let's click here on Edit, and then we're going to open up the Preferences. So in Blender's user preferences, we're going to click over here on System, and you can see that there is Cycles Render Devices. So probably on default for you, it's going to be set to none, but there are different settings, and these different settings here, these four here, the CUDA, the optics, and these other ones, these are going to depend on what GPU you have. So it's really going to depend on your GPU. I usually change this to the optics because I think that works great for my GPU. You can see here is my CPU in my computer, and then the GPU which I put in my computer is the NVIDIA GeForce RTX 280 Super. So you can click through these settings and see which ones will appear. So for my GPU, I like to use optics, and then I can check mark the GPU, and then that's going to tell it that it's going to use it. Now, if for some reason your GPU isn't coming up on any of these options here, then there may be a few reasons for that. One reason is that you might not actually have a GPU in your computer. So if you don't know, then just check to make sure you do have a GPU in your computer. And then as well as that, if you haven't set up the GPU drivers on your computer, then this won't show up. So I've already set up the drivers on my computer. I use the Linux Mint Cinnamon operating system. So on Linux Mint, I've set up the NVIDIA drivers. So whether you're using Linux, Mac, or Windows, whatever operating system you're using, you're going to need to go to the driver settings on your computer and make sure that you've set up the drivers for your GPU. Now, another reason that you may not see the GPU settings is if your GPU isn't compatible with Blender. So if you have a very old GPU, then it may not be compatible with Blender. I think most GPUs are compatible with Blender. I believe the Blender developers do the best job they can to support as many GPUs as possible in Blender. So I would expect your GPU probably would work in Blender. However, you could go to Blender's website or search online and just see if the GPU that you have in your computer works within Blender. Now, what's really cool about Blender is you can actually check mark your CPU and GPU and it will actually render with both. So if you want to, you could check mark both of them. And then once you've set up your settings, again, make sure to click on the Save Preferences button so that it always saves that preference in your future Blender projects. Now, if I just close Blender's user preferences, there is just one more setting that I need to turn on, and that is that I need to actually change the device from CPU to GPU. And so now with how I set it up, it's actually going to render using my CPU and GPU in Blender. And so you might notice that it's actually rendering much faster. So you can see that kind of those grainy bits go away much quicker. Now, if this is the first time that you've switched Blender over to your GPU, then it may give you a message saying that it's loading. And so you might just need to wait a few minutes for it to load up, because when you first start using a GPU in Blender, sometimes it does just take a minute or two for Blender to set it up for rendering. So now I'm just going to go over the main settings that I think you need to know for the Cycles rendering engine. So you can see there are lots of different settings here. There are like light paths and volumes and different things like that. I'm not going to go over all these right now because I just want to go over the main things that you need to know. So just for now, the only thing that I'm going to cover is the sampling, because the sampling really is the main setting. These other settings here you usually aren't going to change. Usually I just leave all these how they are. The main setting that you're going to want to play around with is the sampling. So the sampling is how nice the scene is going to render. So if the samples are very low, then the scene won't really look that nice. But as you add more and more samples, the Cycles rendering engine is going to do more passes and it's going to go through and refine the image more and more. So just for an example, here on the sampling, there is viewport sampling right here, And there's also render sampling. So you can tell Blender how many samples you want it to use in the viewport and then also in the render. So for example, this max samples here, I could turn this way down to a very small number. And now you can see that when I move around the scene, the sample stops, so it kind of stops doing those passes, and so it stops refining the image more and more. But you can see it doesn't really look that great. You can kind of see right here, there's all these little speckles, and we call these fireflies in Blender. So right now you can see the samples is set to 1, the max samples is set to 1, and so it doesn't really look that nice. Let's take this max samples here, and I can type in like 1,000. So now right up here in the corner, you can see every time I move it, it's going to have to redo the samples. But you can see right up here, it's showing you how many samples it's doing. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's quickly going up at 30 and then 40. So it's quickly rendering the scene. Now you can see right here, it's not actually doing all the samples. It kind of goes up to maybe a few hundred and then it suddenly stops and it says rendering done. And that is because of this noise threshold. So the noise threshold is going to determine whether it should keep on rendering that area. And so if you turn this noise threshold really big, you can see it doesn't really care if there's still a lot of noise, and it's just going to finish the rendering. So you can see the rendering is already done, but there is quite a bit more noise. If you turn the noise threshold very small, you can see it's going to render a bit more, and so now it looks a little bit more smooth before it finishes rendering, and you can see it's still rendering. We're at 200, now 300, and we're now at 500, and it's going to continue to go up and up. And so now you can see that the noise is very, very smooth. And so you can change this noise threshold depending on how nice you want the image to look. Now I can also turn the noise threshold off, and if I turn the noise threshold off, it's not going to use that threshold, so it's not going to decide whether it should finish rendering or not depending on the noise. It's just going to render the exact samples. So you can see here, up here on the samples, it's going up to 100, and then it's almost at 200, and it will continue to go up until it reaches 1,000. Now 1,000 is a lot of samples, so you don't actually need 1,000. Generally when I'm rendering things, I usually render around 1 to 200 samples, but it will depend on what you're rendering. So you can really do whatever you want. If you want to turn on this noise threshold, this will be great because it won't have to render all the frames. Once there is a level of noise that it has gotten rid of, then it's just going to finish the rendering and it will stop rendering. So I'm going to turn this back to the default of 0.01. So as well as there being a maximum samples, there's also a minimum samples. So let's say I want Blender to at least render 100 samples. Well, on the minimum samples, I could type in 100, and now no matter what the noise threshold is, it's at least going to render 100 frames, but then it might finish after that. Now you might be wondering how we can get rid of all of this noise, and there's actually a denoise feature which will denoise the image. So let's click here on denoise to enable it, and you can see that now it kind of looks a little bit splotchy. You can see as I'm moving this around before it adds more samples, it looks a little bit splotchy in some areas, but you can see the image looks really nice now. So it's quite smooth, and in the shadows it's gotten rid of all that noise. So the denoise is really nice. I use the denoise all the time, and there's a few settings if you open up the denoise. So this denoise here, you can actually tell it to use the optics. I'm going to do that because I'm using my GPU with the optics. So I'm going to do optics. And then there's also passes here, and for the passes you can either choose none, albedo, or albedo and normal. Now I like to use albedo and normal. Now what the albedo is that is the same thing as the base color, and then also the normal is the bump map or the normal map, which I talked about in the previous part of the tutorial. And so when you give it this data, it's going to use those textures and those colors to kind of help it denoise. Now there's also a start sample, and so this is when the denoise is going to start. So for example, if you didn't want it to denoise the image until it's rendered like 100 frames, I could type in 100, and now you can see it's grainy, and we'll just wait for it to render 100 frames. So now it's at 50 and 70, and now you can see that after 100 it'll start to denoise it. So if you wanted it to wait to denoise, you could turn that up, or you could turn it way down to 0 and it'll automatically start denoising it as soon as it renders. The denoise helps you to use much less samples, so it really does speed up the render. Now the render settings are going to have the exact same settings. So you can choose all the settings, you can choose the noise threshold, you can choose the amount of samples, and you can also use this denoise, so when it renders the image it will denoise it. And so really I like to just keep these settings kind of the same. So maybe for the max samples I could just turn this again to 10, and then also I could turn on that denoise, and you can just leave these settings how they are. Alright, so now that we've gone over the rendering engine, let's talk about the different lights. So what I'm going to do is just select this light, and I'll hit X and click on delete. We can now add all the different lights, and I'm going to make sure I'm in the rendered view so I can see what the lights are doing. So if you press Shift A for the Add menu, you can go down here to Light, and there's 4 main lights in Blender. So let's go over all of these. So the first light is the point light. And so if I hit G to grab and move the light over, this light is going to be very similar to a light bulb because it's going to emit light out from all angles. So the Z-axis, the Y-axis, the X-axis, it's just going to be like a big sphere or a ball of light. And so you can kind of see how that's looking. The light isn't going in one direction, it is shooting out from all areas. So it's basically like a circle of light. Now if you click here on the object data properties with the light selected, you can change the light settings. So within each light, you can actually click here to change the type of light to each light. I'm going to leave it at the point light. Now on the light settings, there is the color, so you can actually change what color you want the light to emit. So I could make it like a nice blue color or whatever color I wanted. Then there is the power, and that is going to be how strong the light is. So I could make it a very dim light or a very bright light. Now there is also this radius here, and if I change the radius, that is going to make the size of the light bigger or smaller. Now if the size of the light is very big, then the lighting is going to be much more soft. So you can see right here the lighting is very soft and smooth, and it almost makes it a little bit less strong, but it is very soft. So if you want very soft lighting, you could make this quite large. However, if I turn the light way down, you can see the light is now going to be much more sharp. And why it is more sharp is because it is being emitted out of a smaller area. So if I zoom in here to the snowman, you can see that shadow there of the arm is very sharp. And if I go back here to the light, let me just select the light, and then let's go back here to the light settings. If I make the radius very small and turn it to 0, you can see that the shadow is extremely sharp. And that's because it is coming out of a smaller area, so it is more sharp. But then if I turn the radius up, you can see it's so smooth. If I make it really big, it is so smooth that there's really no shadow there. And that's because there's more light coming out from different positions. And so all of the light is kind of making the shadow go away because it's casting a shadow from multiple angles. So you can kind of think about this as being like a cloudy day and a sunny day. So if you go outside on a very overcast day when there are lots of clouds, the sun is still in the sky, but the clouds are covering the sun. And so there's lots of even light coming from the clouds from the sky. And so usually if you look down and try to see your shadow, it's pretty hard to see your shadow, and your shadow is pretty blurred and it's not very strong. And so this is what a cloudy day might look like. However, you can also think about a very sunny day. So imagine you go outside and it's a very, very sunny day. There isn't any clouds in the sky. It's very clear. Well, when it's a sunny day, because there's no clouds, there's just going to be a very small area where the light is coming from, because the sun is where the light is coming from the sky. So when the outdoors is lit up by sunlight without any clouds, if you look down at your shadow, you can usually see a very clear, sharp shadow. All right, so let's hit the X key and we'll just delete this light. We'll go to the Add menu with Shift A. I can go here to Light, and let's add the next light, which is the sunlight. Let's hit G to grab and move the sunlight over. And this sunlight is really good for creating daylight scenes because it's going to act like actual sunlight. Now, this sunlight is actually going to emit light from all areas in the 3D scene. So if I press Shift A for the Add menu and go here to Mesh and add a cube, even if I move this cube really far away, you can see it's still getting the same amount of light. If I duplicate the cube and move this cube over, you can see how light the top of the cube is, and it is directly underneath this light. But even if I go way over here to the other side of the scene, it's still getting the same amount of light. And that is because the sunlight is going to add the same even amount of light across the entire scene. And so this is really good for outdoor daylight scenes, because if I go here to the point light is only going to emit light out from this area. So if I turn the power up, you can see it is making this cube pretty bright. But then if I press Shift D to duplicate this and move it over, because this light is only emitting light over here, you can see this cube is in shadow. So that's the difference between the sunlight. So the sunlight will emit the same even amount of light across the entire scene. And then depending on the rotation of the light, that is where it's going to emit the light. So if you want to be like an evening scene or a morning scene, you could rotate the light and have it on an angle. Or if you wanted it to look like noon or in midday, you could rotate this light and have it coming down like that. Now you can change the color here, and usually when I'm using a sunlight, I like to use a very, very slight yellow color to make it look more like sunlight. And then I can also turn the strength up, maybe turn it to like a 10 so it's very bright. And then there is also this angle here, and the angle is going to be kind of the same thing that we talked about earlier with the point light, and that's going to change the sharpness of the light. So usually for sunlight, I do like to turn the angle down so it's a little bit more sharp. All right, so let's delete the sunlight. So just hit X and delete, and I'll now press Shift A for the add menu. Let's go here to light, and we'll add the next one, which is the spotlight. So the spotlight, if I move it around, the spotlight is going to be very similar to like a theater light. So a theater light on a stage, because the spotlight is going to only emit light from this area, but instead of emitting it all around, it's only going to emit it where the cone is. So I can turn up the power and make it stronger. And just so you can see what the spotlight is doing better, I'm going to press Shift A for the add menu. I'm going to go to mesh, and I'm going to add a plane, and I can scale the plane up. So this light could be very useful for creating things like a spotlight on a stage, or maybe like a searchlight, or also if you're creating like a flashlight, this would be really useful for a flashlight. And then this light also has similar settings, so you can change the color. You can also change the power here to make it more and less strong. And then it also has a radius value. So similar to the other lights, you can make the light really sharp or very soft. Now there's also the beam shape, so you can make the beam bigger or smaller. So I can make it really small. Let me actually turn the radius down, and now that beam is going to be very specific, or I could just turn this up and it will be bigger. And then there's also a blend value, and this is going to blend the edges. So you could make the edges very sharp, or you could make it much more soft. Now there's also this show cone button, and if I hold down the Z button and go back to solid view, this show cone is very useful if you want to see where the light is going to hit in the viewport. So I can just move this around and I can see where the light is actually going to hit. All right, let's delete that light. I'll press Shift A for the add menu. We can go here to light, and let's also add the area light. Let's bring the area light up here and rotate it, and I can again go up into the rendered view to see what this is doing. So the area light is this plane, and it's only going to emit light from one side of the plane. So right over here, if I just duplicate this snowball, you can see it's not really emitting light. It is reflecting the light from the ground. Let me just delete the ground though. So you can see this area light is going to light from this angle, but over here on this angle, you can see it's not really emitting light at all. So this snowball is very dark. So it's only going to emit light out from one side, the side with the line. And so there is, again, the color here, so you can change the color to whatever you want. You can also change the power just like the other lights. And then the area light also has a shape setting. So you can choose square, you can also choose rectangle, and then you can change the size of the rectangle. You can also change this to disc, and now it's going to be like a circle. And you could also change this to ellipse, and then you can change the size of that circle. And then there's also this cast shadow button. If for some reason you don't want it to cast any shadows, you could turn that off, and that looks really weird because there should be a shadow there. So usually I leave the cast shadow on to make it more realistic. And then there's also this spread here, so I can make the spread very small, and now you can see that it's a little bit more sharp on the edges, or if I turn the spread way up, again, it's going to be much more soft. Alright, so those are all of the 4 main light objects that you can add in a Blender. Now, as well as the objects lights, there's 2 other types of lighting. There is material lights and there is world lights. So let's first go over material lights. So if I just delete this object, if I go to the add menu, I can just add a few objects here. So for example, I'll add a sphere, scale it down, and I'll just shade that object smooth. I could also maybe add a plane and just rotate the plane over. All right, so what you can do is you can actually add a material to the light, which will actually make it emit light. So if you go over here to the material properties, let's click on new here to add a new material, and I can just call this like light 1. Now you can see the principled shader isn't really what we want. If we wanted to, we could open up this emission here, and we could turn up the emission strength on the principled shader, but just to make things a bit simpler, instead of using the principled shader, I'm going to click on this yellow dot here to change the shader, and I can change it to emission. So emission is going to emit light. So if I turn this strength up to make it brighter, you can see it's also going to act as a light. So the actual material is emitting out light. Now, something to note is that if you are using the Eevee rendering engine, real quick, I'll just change this over to Blender Eevee, you can see the emission lights aren't going to work. And again, this is because Eevee is a real-time rendering engine, so it isn't as realistic. And so it's not actually going to simulate the light. So even though it appears as though it is really bright, especially if I turn up the bloom, if I turn on that bloom setting in Eevee, it appears as though it's a really bright light, and it is an emission, but it's not actually reflecting off the other objects. So if you are using Blender EV, then it would be better just to use one of these other lights. So for example, an area light for lighting your scenes. If you're using cycles though, let me just change it back to cycles, you could use these emission objects. So I'll go back here to the material. So because this is an emission from the material, you can use the material to edit the light. So here I could change the color, so just click on that color and it will bring up the color wheel. You could make it whatever color, and you can also change the strength. So material lighting is also another great way to light your scenes if you're using the Cycles rendering engine. I'm just going to select both of these objects. I will hit the X key and let's just click on delete. Now the last type of light is the world lighting, and the world lighting is going to be what's in the background. So if you click right over here on this little world here, this world icon, this is going to go to the world lighting. And right now on default, the world lighting is very gray, so it is lighting the scene a little bit, but it's very dark. Now here on the color, you can make the color, so I could make it fully black and now everything is dark, or I could make it much lighter, but because it's just kind of like a gray color, everything is very gray and there really isn't much shadows. I could turn up the strength and make it brighter, but now it's just going to be a big bright light. So instead of just using a blank color, we could add in a background image to actually add lighting. So one thing that I want to show you, which is really cool, is a built-in sky background. So if you click here on this yellow dot next to color, this is going to bring up the options to change what the background is going to show. And so there's different things like the noise texture. Let me just make the light a bit less strong. So if I go here to the strength, I can turn it to 1, and now you can see there's actually going to be a noise texture in the background. I could instead click on this light here and I could change it to gradients, and now there's going to be like a gradient texture, and there's many different textures like a magic texture, and these are all of the procedural textures in Blender, like the wave texture and all the other ones. But I could instead change it to the sky texture. So click on the yellow dot next to color, and you can choose sky texture, and this is actually going to create kind of like a basic sky background for us. And we don't have any emission lights, so you can see that the light is just coming from the sky. So this is really cool, and there's a few different settings. So there are 3 different types. There's this first one, I'm not even going to try to pronounce these, and this kind of has some nice blue, and then it has kind of some yellow down here. And there's a few different settings. You can like turn up this value, or you can turn this way down. I'm actually going to turn it down so that it's a little bit more sharp. So I'll maybe turn it down to like that. And then I can also turn up the strength. So if I turn this up, now you can see there's just going to be like some blue sky lighting above us. And then there's also this little circle here, and you can actually drag the circle, and that is going to kind of rotate the light. Then there's also the second one here. So this one, I'll change it to this one in the middle. And this one is a pretty cool one. So you can see by dragging around this little sphere here, it's going to change the light direction. So if I like drag it over here, now you can almost see it looks like a sunset or a sunrise. If I drag it right here into the center, now it's going to kind of look like daylight. So there's kind of blue up here, and then it almost appears as though there's a sun right up here, or I can like turn it way down, and then it's going to look super dark. And then let's also choose the third one. So I'll choose this one here. And again, these are all procedural skies because I'm not using any texture from my computer. These are just procedural skies in Blender. So this one is pretty cool. This one has a bunch of different settings. So there's like air settings, there's dust settings, and ozone settings. So this is really cool. I could maybe turn up the ozone to make it more blue. And you can see this has some very direct light. There's also sun intensity. So this one is actually going to have some sun settings. So I could turn the sun up if I want it to be brighter. I could also change the sun size if I want the sun to be bigger or smaller. And then let's also change the sun elevation. So if it's like a morning scene, if I like turn this way down, let me just make it a very, very small number. You can see now it looks like the sun is rising, or maybe the sun is setting, and we have that nice blue color. So that is actually really cool looking. Now, as well as using these different procedural textures in Blender, we can actually add which is called an HDRI into Blender. So to add an HDRI, we can click here on environment texture. Now you can see everything is turned pink, and if something turns pink in Blender, then that is Blender telling us that it doesn't know what texture to use because we haven't added a texture, or maybe it lost the texture data, so it doesn't know where the texture is on your computer. So we can click on open here and we can open up a texture. Now to get HDRI lighting in Blender, we need to download some HDRI files online. And a really great website for downloading high quality free HDRIs is polyhaven.com. This is an amazing website, and they have really high quality HDRIs, and all of their assets are licensed as Creative Commons 0, so you can use them for even commercial projects. So I'm going to click here on Browse HDRIs. This is an amazing website, and if you would like to support them, they do have a Patreon page, so you can definitely check that out if you'd like to support them. So you can see these HDRIs, if I just click on one of them, these are 360-degree images. So they're basically these large panoramic images, and if I just click here on 3D, you can actually see what this is looking like if I load it up. So you can see I can rotate this around, and these are 360-degree images which are taken from the real world. And so what we can do is we can add these HDRIs into our Blender world, and then it's going to use all of this lighting data to light our scenes. And so HDRIs are super helpful if you want to get very realistic lighting. Now, because I usually like to create realistic things in Blender, I use HDRIs for almost all of my scenes. So you can see there's different colors here of like the grass and the dirt. And so if you add this HDRI into Blender, then the objects are going to reflect all of the lighting, and they're going to reflect all the colors, and it will really make the scene much more realistic. And what's really cool about these HDRIs is they actually have lighting information. And so where the sunlight is, it's actually going to emit light, and it's going to look like it's a daylight scene. So I love using HDRIs. HDRIs are a great way to get super realistic lighting and super realistic reflections, and I definitely recommend using them in your scenes, especially if you're going for realism. And polyhaven.com is a really great place to get very high quality HDRIs. Now, something about HDRIs is that they are quite large file sizes. So if you download a very high resolution HDRI, it'll actually really slow down your render time, because the HDRI is such a large file size. Because it's so big, it will take longer to render. Now, you don't actually need that big of a file size if you're just getting the lighting data and the reflections. If your HDRI is being used as a background, like if you're actually rendering it in the background, then you might want to download a higher quality image, like maybe the 8K or the 16K. But if you're just getting some lighting data and some color information, you can really just use the 1K or the 2K. So I'm just going to choose 1K, and then there's also an HDR type and an EXR type. I just use HDR. I'm going to use HDR. There are some different types here. You can actually read about them, but I usually just use HDR. HDR works fine, and then you can click on download. Now, specifically, the one that I'm going to use for the snowman scene is going to be this snowy field on Polyhaven, so link will be in the description if you'd like to download this. So I'll download the 1K version and the HDR version, and then I will download it. So now let's add in our HDRI into Blender. So once you've downloaded it, you can just put it in a folder somewhere with all of your HDRIs. Just put it somewhere on your computer, and then let's click on open and open up the HDRI. So I'll just locate to the folder where I saved the HDRI, and I'll just double click on it to open it up. And then this strength here, let's turn it back to the default, which is 1. So we've added the HDRI into Blender, and you can kind of see, if you look closely at kind of the trees, it does look a little bit pixelated and low quality, and that's because I just downloaded the 1K version. However, it really doesn't matter that much because I'm mainly just looking at the snowman. I'm not really going to see the HDRI in the background, but just by looking at the snowman, you can really see how realistic it looks. So if you kind of look at the reflections, you can see it's reflecting all the light and the colors, and it really just makes the scene look so much more realistic. Because in the real world, there's lots of things around you. If you just look around you, like I can see my computer monitor, I have my water bottle right here, I have like a little wooden table here, and I have my computer mouse, and I have lots of different things with different colors. And so in the real world, there's lots of different objects around you, whether you're inside or outside. And so there's also different lights around your scene. And so in the real world, there's lots of different colors and things to reflect. So this is why HDRIs are super helpful for realism. You can also see right here in the HDRI, there is a sun right there, and that sun data is actually in the HDRI's data. And so there's actually a bright light here shining on the front of the snowman. And then kind of in the background here, behind the snowman, there is kind of a shadow. But then the front of the snowman has that light. And you can also turn the strength up if you want it to be brighter. And just to show you the reflections a bit better, I will go to the add menu, and I'm just going to go here and add a UV sphere. Let's scale the UV sphere down, and then I'm just going to shade it smooth. You don't have to follow along with this if you don't want to, but you can. Let's also click on new here to add a new material, and then I will turn this metallic value all the way up to 1. And then I can turn this roughness value down. So now we have a really shiny sphere, and you can really see what the HDRI is doing. So this looks much more realistic than just using a plain color, because in the real world, everything has some amount of reflections, and of course, very shiny objects like this metallic sphere has reflections. And in the real world, there's lots of different objects and different colors and things. So adding HDRIs really helps to to add realism to your scene. And you can also see there's the snowman being reflected in the shiny metal sphere. Alright, so I'm just going to select this metallic sphere here, and I'll just hit X and let's just delete it. Alright, so I like how the lighting is, although I just want to add a little bit more brightness. So I could turn the brightness up of the entire thing, but the problem with that is that it also makes the shadows kind of brighter. So as well as adding this HDRI lighting in the background to get some nice reflections, I'm also going to just add a sunlight. So I will go to the add menu, let's go here to light, and I can just add a sunlight, and then I can rotate the sunlight, and I want the sunlight to be about the same direction as the HDRI light, so I'm just going to rotate it over so it's about going at the same direction, so the lighting looks accurate. And then also the strength here, I could maybe turn this up to like a 4 so it's a bit brighter, or maybe just like a 3, so that is pretty good. And I could even move the sunlight over so it's not going through the snowman. Now there is one more thing that I want to do to the lighting to make it look a little bit nicer, and that is to edit the color management. So what I'm going to do right here is go to the render properties, and then I'm going to scroll way down, and I'm going to click here on color management. So I'm just going to open up this color management tab. Now here in the view transform, I would either use Filmic or AGX, and the Filmic and AGX are going to be more accurate and more realistic than the standard. If I change this to standard, you can see everything looks a bit more sharp and it does look a bit brighter, but you can see that everything's kind of blown out. The lighting is a bit blown out, and so it's not able to actually get as much lighting exposure. So I wouldn't recommend the standard. It just isn't quite as realistic. You can kind of see here on the snowman, it's like really bright and blown out. So I would either use Filmic, or you can just use the default one, which is AGX. Now, why I'm going here to the color management is because of this look here. And so you can use this look to kind of do a little bit of color correction and just make the whole lighting pop out and make the colors pop and just make it a bit more contrasty and saturated. So usually for my scenes, what I like to do is change this look to either the high contrast or the very high contrast, or you could also choose punchy. So let's start by just trying the high contrast, and you can see already that looks quite a bit nicer. So the lighting is a bit more sharp and the colors are a bit more saturated, and it just kind of pops out the image a bit more. You could also choose the very high contrast. So let's change this to very high contrast. That looks maybe even a little bit nicer. You could also change this look here to the punchy, and that's pretty cool, although it is a little bit darker. So you could also use the gamma and the exposure, maybe just turn the exposure up. So for me, I really like to use just like the very high contrast. The very high contrast is what I use for most things. Now you can also open up the use curves here, and you could turn on the use curves, and you could do some manual color correction. So we used the RGB curves node earlier in the tutorial series, and this use curves is really the same way. So you could like change these curves here by dragging it over to this side or down here to this side. You could also like add more blue. If you click here on B, you can click here and drag this up if you want things to look more blue or less blue. That's actually kind of cool. So I might add a little bit of blue. So it just kind of adds some color correction here in the render. So I think adding a bit more blue looks a little bit nice because it looks kind of like a winter scene. You know, white and blue are really nice for winter scenes. So I might just turn up that blue a little bit. And then also you can drag kind of the brightness and the darkness. And if you wanted this to look even more contrasty, you could actually add kind of like an S shape to the curve. So I could click here and drag this dot up a little bit, and then I could click here to add another dot, and I could drag this dot down a little bit. So by adding kind of this little shape here, it's going to add kind of like a bit more contrast, and that contrast is actually a bit too strong. Now it's kind of blown out, but you could do that if you wanted to. Now if you want to get rid of some of these dots here, you can select the dot, and then you can click on this little X button to get rid of it. And if you want to get rid of all of them, you could do that. So just click X, and then click on this one and just click X, and you could restart. So I might just make it look a tiny bit more sharp if I want to, just by kind of dragging this around and making like a very subtle curve there. But I don't want it to be too contrasty or blown out, so you should be careful with this. You definitely don't want to go overboard and do too much. So this is going to wrap it up for the lighting part of this tutorial series. So I hope you learned a lot. I hope you were easily able to follow along, and thank you for watching. And if you'd like to learn even more about lighting, then I actually have a specific video dedicated to lighting, and that video is called Lighting for Beginners. So if you'd like to check out that Lighting for Beginners tutorial, I go into a little bit more depth. I do cover all the things that I went over in this video, but I go a little bit more in depth into lighting. So if you'd really like to learn more about lighting and get a better grasp of lighting in Blender, you can definitely check out that video. So in the next part of the tutorial series, we are going to be finishing up the materials, and we're also going to create a few more procedural materials. We're going to go into a little bit more advanced procedural materials. materials. So we're going to create a cool procedural material for the carrot nose, and we're also going to create a cool procedural material to make this look like some icy snow. So to watch the next part, it'll be right up there on the end screen when it's released, and also I will have the link in the description. And again, if you're enjoying these videos and you'd like to help support this channel, then a great way to do that is by checking out my Patreon page where you can support the channel monthly, or you can check out my Gumroad store where I have lots of Blender products. But thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next part.